Welcome to MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 98. A guten Chodesh, being that this evening and tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh Shvat. So may everyone be blessed with a very abundant month, materially and spiritually. And being that that's timely, let's begin, share a few words in the context of Chassidus Applied, connected to Rosh Chodesh Shvat, a date that the Rebbe would refer to time and again in such a kfiyas, in such a time when either Shabbos was Rosh Chodesh or it was that week, referring to a pasuk in the Torah, a verse in Dvarim, right in the beginning of Dvarim, Be'ashti asher chodesh be'echad lachodesh, Ba'eres HaTorah hazeis. That Rosh Chodesh Shvat was the day where actually the Chumash Dvarim begins, states exactly when it begins to be said. As we know, Chumash Dvarim, the final fifth book of the Torah, is called Mishnah Torah because Moshe Rabbeinu began reviewing then the entire experiences that they went through in the last three books. And this would be for 37 days, because at that point the Moshe already knew that 37 days from Rosh Chodesh Shvat would be Zayin Adar, the 7th of Adar, and therefore he began to review it all in a sense like a last will and testament of Moshe Rabbeinu. And that's why the Torah begins in Dvarim, right in the beginning, that when did it begin? Rosh Chodesh Shvat. And Rosh Chodesh Shvat, he began to explain the Torah. What does it mean to explain the Torah? Ba'eres HaTorah hazeis. So there's a verse later in Kisaveh, Ba'er Heitev, it says, a similar expression, Heitev, and the Rashi and the commentaries, the Medrash explain, is that he explained it and translated it into 70 languages. The Rashi's commentaries on Rashi say that because Heitev is the gematria b'tzirufei of 70. As we know, number in numerical configurations, there's sometimes a straightforward gematria, which is simply the adding up the numerical equivalent of each letter. So in Heitev would actually be Hey is 5 and Yud is 10 and 9 is 19, and then Beis is 21. How does it turn into 70? Because b'tzirufei, what that means is you do it like this. You do Hey, then you do Hey Yud Tes, and Hey Yud Tes Vav. So in a sense, the first letter is counted 4 times, the second letter 3 times, and the third letter twice, and the last letter once. You add that up, that turns into 70. What's the point? The point being, Shivim Lashon is the emphasis that the Rebbe focuses on, is the idea of what the Frierdiker Rebbe began, and the Chodesh Shvat, of course, the Frierdiker Rebbe's Stalkus, Yud Shvat, 10 days into Shvat, that he began translating Chassidus into many different languages. Not necessarily 70 in the full number, but the idea of applying and teaching it in many different languages was the Frierdiker Rebbe began to initiate that. Though there are a few things we know that the Rebbe Rashab, the Razah, translated certain pieces of Chassidus in Russian, but in a kfiyasdik way, in an orderly way, in a way that was published, which is tfus, as the Tzemach Tzedek says, that tfus, something in print, is l'deidus, is for generations. The Frierdiker Rebbe began doing that. That's where you find in the 40s, you find translations of different Chassidic books, including Tanya began to be translated then, and some others. Now, obviously, this took on a whole different dimension under the Rebbe, continuing with that theme. But the Rebbe makes this into an important shlav, an important stage in the development of Chassidus. Now, you could think translation was the big thing. Once you have the originals, translating is but translation is a big thing because it demonstrates that you're not just translating the word for word, you're also translating it in the paradigm and in the format and in ways that are applicable, Chassidus Applied, applicable and relevant to the person who speaks the other language. So translating something from Hebrew or Yiddish, the Rabbeim spoke in Yiddish but wrote many of the Maimorim in Hebrew, translating that into English, for example, is not just a translation. It requires a deeper understanding of the idea, as the Rebbe brings from the Ibn Tibun, who translated the Rambam, that for a translation to be effective, a real good, authentic translation, you have to know the original, the source language, you have to know the language in which you're writing, and of course you have to know the content. Because the content, you can't just write it literally, or else it won't be fully understood. So the translation of Ba'er Heitev, what Moshe Rabbeinu began doing in Rosh Chodesh Shvat, was not just another teacher teaching an idea, it was actually bringing it into a language and into a format and into a paradigm that would be applicable and relevant to people who may not know that original. So it really demonstrates Chassidus being permeating, the Hafotzas Hamayonos Chutzos, spreading and disseminating and permeating every type of idiom and every type of language and form of language. And that, of course, demonstrates its reach. Yefutza ma'nesecha chutza. So what's chutza? Chutza is the outer world, the secular world. How you can't reach them if you don't speak in that language. In Torah Mishpatim, the Alter Rebbe makes a whole thing about speaking Torah in different languages. For example, the fact that the Talmud, most of it, is written in Aramaic. Why was that insisted? The people knew Hebrew, could have been written in Hebrew, because there's something about birur halashenis, refining the languages. Vayeshev Tafshin Nun, the Rebbe spoke about it at length as well. The idea of refining languages, which is part of the birur, part of the refinement of the customs of the land, which includes their language. So in that sense, what happened began with Rosh Shvat was a monumental day in the context of teaching Chassidus in ways that would reach completely new audiences and make it accessible to those that were not familiar with or would not have a know-how or experience or knowledge in the original. And therefore, it represents essentially what Applied Chassidus is all about. That type of presentation and translation in more ways than one. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, did this through a whole chumash from Rosh Shvat till Zayin Adar, as I mentioned. This, of course, includes the famous pasuk that I've addressed last week in the previous episodes. Korav elecha hadover me'ed b'ficha b'lvavcha la'asesei. That's stated later in the end of Parsha Nitzavim, also in Deuteronomy, also part of these 37 days. And that, of course, is the basis for the entire Tanya, and by extension, all of Chassidus. So, when you read Sefer Dvarim, this fifth book, Deuteronomy as it's called, you discover, even though there are some things and many times that there are repeats of the same ideas and even the same words, there's always some emphasis. And Chassidus explains that Moshe Rabbeinu, mepi atzmei omar. The fourth books, he spoke not in the first person, I, because he was repeating what God was telling him. Here he speaks in the first person, because this is Moshe Rabbeinu speaking through his language, which exactly is the idea of translation. That Moshe is telling it to us in a way through his lens, which of course is Moshe is Ish Elokim, a divine person, but yet it brings it down a level closer to ourselves. And that's Torah in general. In context of Chassidus, this is what this date represents. And of course, Rosh Shvat would be the Reish, the head that includes Yud Shvat, which is coming in 10 days. Yud Shvat, the Yortzeit, and the Stalkus of the Frierdiker Rebbe, when all his Aveda elevates, and a big part of it was the beginning process, especially when he established the mezdas that the Frierdiker Rebbe appointed the Rebbe to head, including the publishing house, Kahos. Karnei Torah became a new stage in the spreading of Chassidus, and this continuously has to accelerate, and therefore, in our day and age today, the year 2016, Tov Shenayim Vov, whatever was done, our job is to Mailam B'Kedesh, to increase in this, and especially on a day like this, to take resolutions of how we can translate, both for ourselves, for family, and especially for people we meet who may not have any clue on understanding the original. How do you translate in a way that makes it relevant? Korav elecha dover me'ed. Now, connected to boy, one of the connections the Rebbe makes is boy al pare, even though on one hand it's a negative, because talking about pare, of course, in Mitzrayim was the ultimate tanin hagadol, he's called, the great serpent, because he represented such a powerful klippa, such a powerful negative energy, to the extent that the Zohar tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu trembled and was afraid to go in, and that's why God says boy al pare. It should have said lech al pare, go to pare. Why does it say come to pare? He's basically answering Moshe's concern, how can he overcome such a powerful negative force? So that Hashem is saying, God is saying, come with me. Come with me into the inner chambers, and we will be able to not just be immune to his power, but to actually transform it, which is exactly what happened. And when Moshe heard that, then that calmed him down, in the sense where he then agreed, and he went in with Hashem, with God, into Pare. But Chassidus also brings from the Zohar that Pari, everything in this world also evolves from a place in holiness and Kedusha. So Pari, in the higher worlds, is Periyo the Kol Neherim. Isperia means it explodes. It explodes, maybe is the best word, I can't find another word, flows with abundance, the contn'd of all the energies. So pare also represents, just like it represents in the negative world, a powerful negative force, it represents the idea of abundant flow. Isperia from the word peria, and in a sense of abundant flow, bursting forth with all the energies and highest levels. So boyal pare also means in that context that Moshe Rabbeinu is entering in receiving these deeper dimensions. Now these are not, even though they seem to be contradictory interpretations, but one is rooted in the other. That when you go in and you can overcome and deal with the challenges, it reveals the greatest energies are where they're embedded in the darkest places. And this is essentially what happened on the Stalkus of Yud Shvat. The Rebbe brings the word Istalkus, means Istalik Yikora Dekuchebricha B'Kula Almin, which means Istalkus doesn't mean removed. It means it's such a high energy that it cannot manifest in a integrated way. So it's called Istalik Yikora Dekuchebricha, as the Rebbe cites from Basaligani, the classic mimer that was given out to learn on Yud Shvat that year. And ever since, the Rebbe would explain and discuss one of the chapters corresponding to one of the 20 chapters of this Hemshel Basaligani. So how do you achieve that? When you teach Chassidus and you have to bring it to a language, sometimes even the language of Pare, of all the different countries in the world, that forces you to have to dig deeper and come out with a deeper understanding. Because the fact is, when you have to explain an idea, let's say about Ein Sof, or idea of the elements, or the idea of any of the spheres, or anything that Chassidus talks about, you have to explain it to someone who's at a state where they are maybe in Erves Ha'aretz, in the decadence of the land. They're immersed in materialism, or they're immersed in places that are not necessarily conducive to the revelation of the divine in Chassidus, in Primus HaTeira, the soul of Torah. So you have to translate in a way to show how this is relevant and how this is indispensable to your life. And in doing so, you have to dig deeper and reach into the Isperia, into levels that you would never have to reach when you're just talking to someone that's on your own level. And as I've discussed many times, where we take for granted and we just say words, Mamala Kalam, Seviv Kalam, and Atzmus, Spheres, and so on, Teyu, Tikkun, Ak, Atzilus. When you have to say it in a word, in language that someone who does not know what any of those words mean, it forces you to go deeper, dig deeper, and reveal deeper elements of the relevance and application and personal, psychological, and emotional application of these ideas. With that said, let's go into questions that have been asked. There continued to come a flow of questions regarding some of the topics I discussed in the previous episodes, hair covering, Tznius, and this is due to the limits of our time and so on. I want to, though I'll touch upon some of the more outgrowth of questions that came from that topic, but I'm not going to go into again and reading all the different letters, because I think I covered more or less the different the balanced approach to this. As I mentioned, hopefully there will be people who will establish more focused websites and resources on this and any other topic, and that would be the more appropriate platform to really go in a more exhaustive way. So make it very clear here, the promise in MyLife Chassidus Applied is not being exhaustive. For that you need a book, or more than one book, and you need to be able to discuss it on and on. I try to cover more, covering many different topics, and trying to at least be somewhat thorough, but even though, as I said, it can't be completely exhaustive. With that said, so there is one of the topics that grew out of this discussion in the past weeks, is about finding a fitting Mashpia. And the questions, I'll read a few of them. I have had no success in finding an appropriate Mashpia. Is it me or is it the Mashpiim? What are the criteria for a fitting and healthy Mashpia? How do I find a healthy Mashpia, basically? Another writer poses this question. Your excellent talks on hair covering, Tznius, and intimacy exposed, at least for me, a fundamental issue. Who we turn to for advice on these matters, as well as other such matters that affect our personal lives. Many of us have simply received either limited information or even misinformation and immature or dogmatic direction from untrained and incompetent, even if well-intentioned, chassan and kala teachers, mashpim, and so on. Begging the question, how do you identify and find the right authority whom you can trust? I know that I'm not the only one struggling with these questions. Many people I speak with have similar issues. Now, this is not the first time I've addressed the topic of Mashpia. I addressed it a number of times, I believe definitely around a year ago. I don't recall now which episode. So whenever I did whenever I did discuss it, see this as complementing that, and I try to address it through the lens and in response to the way the questioners pose this question. Here's a good opportunity to invite you to pose any of your questions on a completely anonymous and confidential forum, which is at meaningfullife.com/mylife. Where there you can both pose questions. If you want to have a response to you personally, please include your email address in your post, which again will be held strictly confidential. But if you don't want to you want to share that, it's completely anonymous, no way to trace it. As well, in the same place, meaningfullife.com/mylife, you'll also find essays that have been written last year's contest and also leading up to the coming contest, which we'll hear about more soon. And as well as previous episodes. We're now already at episode 98, so there's 97 episodes, including this one will be 98, and you can view it at your own leisure, at your own comfort. So, in responding now to these questions, let me say this. We always get into the delicate area when you're dealing with speaking to many different people. The area of one size does not fit all. And there's no generic responses, but we do have guidelines. The first place I would turn to, besides the introduction to Tanya, with Alter Rebbe says that the Delim Shebe'ir should not refrain from offering people answers to direction they should get from Tanya, is the Farbrengen Yutas Kislev Tovshin Lamed Zayin and the Farbrengens afterwards, including Rosh Chodesh Shvat, Yud Shvat, Tu B'Shvat, when the Rebbe established and came to renew the whole idea of Mashpia. Fascinating material there that most people I talk to, I'm simply not aware of, which includes also criteria that the Rebbe himself states what a good mashpia is like. However, as I said, different people speak to different individuals. And it's very important to find someone that you can trust, obviously, someone that is competent in the sense that knowledgeable in Chassidus and Torah, and someone who has common sense. This is called the fifth Shulchan Aruch. The fifth Shulchan Aruch means common sense. I remember once the Rebbe, I remember when it was, but it was in the Mems, he was talking about the Rambam, about what the requirements to be a Chaver in Sanhedrin. So though we're not talking about being a member in the Supreme Court of Judaism called the Sanhedrin, but nevertheless we can derive lessons from there. And it says there that in the order, it says first it should be a Chochem and then it should be a Yedei Torah. Not sure what the language there is. And the Rebbe once asked, why? Why doesn't it say first the first thing is knowledge and Torah? That's a Sanhedrin. Because the first thing we need is intelligence. Street smartness, you can say, common sense, because you could know book smart and know the entire Torah and not understand the practicality of how to apply it to people at what speed and in ways that are not dogmatic, in ways that people could listen to it. So it's critical to follow your heart. Now, obviously, this needs to be balanced, because if we just follow our heart, the whole point of an Aseh L'Charav or Mashpia is that it's not about just you. Because the whole point is a certain Kabbalah sale that you're accepting someone's authority. The Rebbe once wrote to a Bocher who was a troublemaker in yeshiva, and he wrote to him essentially this. He says, Temchet Mim was established, and this you definitely can apply beyond Temchet Mim as well, the same logic, in a way that you don't have one Mashpia, you have at least two of different temperaments and different personalities, because Bochrim are different, and therefore find yourself the Mashpia that speaks to you, but then stick to him. You can't just run from one to the next, because then it undermines the whole element of listening and the modus and the mashmas that's necessary, which essentially means accepting an authority, suggesting something to you or saying something to you. There's also the idea of Aseh L'Charav and Kanei L'Chachaver, which is acquiring a friend. A friend is not quite a Rav, obviously. A Rav is more authority. As the Rebbe speaks in the Sheftim Nun Aleph, Tafshin Nun Aleph, Sikha, there is in your Sheftayich and Yoyitzayich. Sheftayich is like Sheftim v'Shetrim. Sheftim is a Shefet, is a judge, it's authority. Yoyitzayich is a Yoyitz, is an advisor. So you have, for example, in business as well, you have advisory boards, and you have management, and you have trustees, and you have people who are in power and make decisions. Others are more advisory. So this all has to be taken into account. Now, of course, as the writer indicates, how do you find the right one? People have been burned, people have been hurt, people sometimes simply can't find someone to speak to. There's no quick answer. We know this for sure. If the Rebbe and the Rabbeim gave us such a directive, it means it's doable. No one's asked to do something they're not capable of doing. So in the context of, especially when it comes to controversial things, it comes to things like, we talked about the hair covering, we talked about Tznius and so on, you have to have someone that you can speak to who has a combination of the elements I mentioned before. Men for men, women for women, I should add, as I've also discussed in previous episodes. And you know something? If something doesn't work for you, which means the person doesn't understand, or you really feel that it's not about you, meaning that you're not ready to accept their directive, they simply are not giving good directives, maybe you should talk with an objective party, just like you would ask another doctor an opinion. One doctor tells you something, you go to another expert. And then there's this note that came my way. It's a caveat from the Rebbe, and I want to read it because I think it's very vital. And again, everything has to be taken with a certain type of qualification, because any note or answer is always to the person who wrote that question. But yet we could derive certain logic. There's a thing called a milsa b'taima, something said with a reason, something said with a svara, with a logic, is not just a gzeres hakosov. And yet at the same time, it could have been said in a certain circumstances. So here's what the Rebbe writes to someone. And I don't know what the context was, but here's the answer. B'rdei lashpia al mishu, in order to influence someone, mishu, anybody, ubafrat ala noyer b'tkufasenu, and especially on the young people in our era, in our day and age, tzarich liyas hadibur imoy kama pomim, you have to speak with that person several times, uba pratis, and in detail, hadrusha, in the appropriate detail, uba oifen shazokuk lahashpa, and in a way that the one that requires, that is dependent on this hashpa, this influence, yargish atzmei, he or she should feel chofshi, free, lizvakeach, to argue, ulanes, and to respond. And those two words are underlined, v'chulu. So to sum that up again, and then there's one more paragraph which I'll read in a moment, that in order to be mashpia mishuhu, which means pretty general almost on anybody, especially on the young in our generation, you have to speak several times and in the appropriate detail, and in a way that the person who needs that direction and guidance should feel free to argue and to ask questions and to ask. If someone sets up a meeting, someone suggests or refers someone to speak to that person that he does not recognize, meaning the person who needs the guidance does not recognize, and you don't have all the potential, above potential that the Rebbe just read from paragraph 1, it also allows, chas v'sholom, God forbid, lahazik. So it's not neutral. It can actually cause damage. Why? Kivin sheyane, because that person who requires guidance can answer, he already met with someone and he already heard, and he was yetzer. He fulfilled what he needed. And that's easy to understand. So it's not just a matter of an optional thing. If you send someone who does not fill those requirements, you can actually cause damage because the person won't want to hear from anyone else. They think they already heard from someone, and then that's that. So it says, clearly this is writing to the person who is meant to be the guy who's going to refer. It says you have to find someone that fits to that person in the way that was I described earlier. And to make an effort that the influence should be through speaking many times. Okay, so as I said, this is written definitely to an individual under certain circumstance, but I think much can be derived from this. And it's interesting, because many people say, what do you mean, Kabbalah sel? What about aseh l'charav, lashon maisin? Asiyah is a lashon maisin that you compel someone. It's not like knei l'chachav where you acquire. You have to compel yourself. The whole idea of going to a mashpia, going to a authority, is listening to them even if you don't like it. So if you're saying you're allowing them to argue and to answer and so on, but we know in Chassidus that both are necessary. Even when you talk about Kabbalah sale, that is the foundation of everything. And it explains in Tanya chapter 41 that this is the Yesod v'Sherish, and the foundation and the root and the foundation of all Aveda is accepting a higher authority, obviously. Kabbalah sel Malchus Shamayim, Kabbalah sel mitzvahs. But then there's a thing called after Nasa comes Nishma. That's also part of it. That tells you that even if you don't understand or you fully don't get it, you still listen. But if you don't have the second part that becomes integrated and internalized, and you can't ask a question and you're just told this is the way it is, the Rebbe says this is not the way to be mashpia on people all the time, and especially in the young people in our times. Had he said only the young people in our times, you could say, you know what, that has to be compromised maybe because young people in our times are not receptive to authority. But here, it's clearly much broader than that, and for obvious reasons. I remember once a beer explanation from the Rebbe in Pirkei Avos, where he begins the second perek in Pirkei Avos, the second chapter in Ethics of the Fathers begins, Rebbe Eimer. Rebbe says, Ezer derech sheyaver lemina adam, what's the way, what's the path that a person should choose for themselves? And it continues saying, Tiferes le'eseh, something that's beautiful for him is beautiful for the ones he's performing for, meaning those for others that watch. And the Rebbe I remember said, it's a strange thing. What do you mean, Ezer derech? The Torah tells you, the whole Torah was given, the Torah is given to us to tell us what to do, what not to do. Suddenly the Mishnah coming out of nowhere and saying, in case you want to know what path to go, it's okay, please, it doesn't tell you to go follow the Torah. It says find something that is beautiful, something that is pleasant to the eye, pleasant to people's, to you and to others. So the Rebbe said, because Pirkei Avos, like all Torah, comes after Perek Rishon. Second chapter comes after the first chapter. So we already learned Moshe Kibbel Torah Sinai, the Kabbalah sale that Moshe received Torah Sinai, and Masada Yeshua, and etc., etc. Then comes chapter 2, that's Nasa, Kedel Nishma. First we accept from Sinai. Moshe Kibbel Torah Sinai, meaning the Kabbalah sale, that he receives it from Sinai and learns from Sinai the bittul that you need, the humility that you need. But now, once you have that foundation in place, now, Ezer derech, it has to be a way that is appealing, that's palatable. As we discussed earlier with the translation of Chassidus, you don't just say, oh, you know something, Kabbalah sale, and just learn in Hebrew. Learn the whole Hebrew before you can start understanding. The point is, it has to become karev elecha, internalized. Sometimes the language for this would be called, and nasa would be the makif, and then comes the pnimi. Because with faith alone, you can end up having, as Chassidus explains, the gamva pumachtat rachmanakari, the thief, before he goes out to steal, he prays to God. Why? Because how's that possible? The God told him, "Leis signum, don't steal." How could he pray to God to help me do something that you told me not to do? It's one thing he has dissonance, and you could say he doesn't talk to God. But he's talking to God and telling God, "Please help me do something you told me not to do." In the 10 Commandments. The answer is because that's what faith is makif, and therefore it could create a dissonance, and he could sincerely be praying and not necessarily applying and realizing that this is about him to personally and internally be changed. So the second half, which is allowing someone to ask a question, even allowing someone to argue, is not about just giving into them and saying, okay, you know what, we'll let them be chutzpahdik, or we'll let them not listen to authority. It's about how to internalize the ideas in ways that they can feel that they own it, which is critical in any good mashpia, shaleves ele me'eleh. And there's no better example than the Rebbe himself, who's mashpia of all mashpiim, and maybe even higher than that, and that is to teach people the restraint necessary to teach people to stand on their own feet. That doesn't mean completely on their own feet. It means that they should be able to use their tools and resources to solve a problem, and not like a baby have to keep running back to the mother or father. To be a flame that rises on its own with the power of the original flame lit by the Kohen Gadol, and as the Rebbe so often emphasizes, and especially in the first sikha, the talks after the Maimer that year, the Yud Shvat Tovshin Yud Aleph, since we're talking about Yud Shvat, established the principle that you have, there's a Veda B'Keach Atzmei, that you have to do things with your own effort. And that's a critical component. If a person feels their wings are being clipped by a Mashpia, and the Mashpia is doing that, that may not be the healthy or right, correct way to do with adults, because you want them to own it, you want them to be able to resolve it even on their own, even when they can't run or call a mashpia. At the same time, obviously we all have times that we need to go to somebody. The classic words of Rabbi Hillel, Im eina nili mili, am nila atzmi ma'ani. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? And then, if I'm for myself, what am I? If I'm only for myself, what am I? That's the balance that's necessary, and any good mashpia will be able to implement that and teach us how to do that, and teach shliach shliach how each one can become a mashpia, can teach another person to become a mashpia by being a living example. Women of the wall. Next topic. What would the Chassidic approach be to women of the wall? I was recently asked my opinion by a Jewish non-observant woman who shared her resentment, frustration, and sincere desire to pray at the kotel, at the Kos Lamaravi, in the way she believes, with kippah, talis, and reading from the Torah. How should I respond? In different language. First, thank you for all you are doing to bring Torah to all. As an observant woman, I was recently asked my opinion about the women of the wall. It repeats more or less what I just read. I responded that I see this as a big problem. On the one hand, the kotel is a place where every Jewish person is welcome to pray to Hashem. In fact, all Jews and non-Jews, men and women, do come there to pray each and every day. On the other hand, I feel that the women of the wall interfere with my davening as a frum woman. I have also responded they have been given another place to pray freely, Robinson's Arch. Rabbi Jacobson, could you please help me answer this person in a more complete way that incorporates her sensitivities and concerns, yet conveys the kedusha of the kotel and how it is being infringed upon by these women? Thank you. Another questioner writes, are the women of the wall who put on tefillin to be admired, in part because they want to put on tefillin? Are frum women lacking because they do not want to put on tefillin? I think not, but in a balance. But it is a balance. In some sense, women of the wall should be finding spirituality in the mitzvahs for women. That they do not do, because it's not about spirituality, but equality. For them, I guess. Okay. So like everything, and I've mentioned this a number of times, we learn from the Rebbe and from the Rabbeim in general that there's the content of an answer and there's the method of answering. You could say the same thing in two ways, one that will alienate and sound obnoxious and condescending, as holier than thou, and you could say the same exact thing without any of that stuff. So we have to depersonalize is always the best way in all these type of approaches. When I say depersonalize, I mean not to become caught up in a debate and in emotional elements, because you're talking here again about hashpah. So this in a way is an extension of being mashpia, because at the end of the day, mashpia is not just an appointed mentor. It could be a situation where you're called upon, and your hashgacha pratis, divine providence, led you to a place where people ask you, what should we do in this case? So the first things first is I think we have to establish that you always have to approach things with sensitivity and with a pleasant darkei noyam. Now obviously you're going to meet people who do not reciprocate and sometimes make your blood boil and you want to say something really harsh, but you have to think 10 times before you say something harsh, not because they may not deserve it, but because what impact will it have? When the Rebbe repeated this many, many, many times, what impact will it have on the other person? If the impact is that it will motivate and inspire them to understand what you're saying, to understand how to look at it with a fresh perspective, absolutely. If what you say, however, just becomes something bitter and the person dismisses you, then what have you achieved? You made a protest. So it's critical to know who you're speaking to and how to speak. And that's why it's very important to establish who this question is, who's asking the question, what their motivation is, and how to respond. Let me share with you briefly an episode that happened with me a number of years ago. Not quite this, but it was very similar in context. And that was, I was called by a rabbi from a certain city in the United States. It's a relatively large Jewish community, from the top 10 Jewish communities in this country, not New York, of course. And he told me he has a big problem. He became a rabbi in a synagogue that was originally an Orthodox synagogue. Later it became a little more conservative. And at some point they took down the mechitza that was always there. Now part of the community wants the mechitza back. Mechitza, of course, is the curtain or the boundary between the men and the women. And he wants me to come, and this has become a whole battle, Everyone's dug in, on both sides of the aisle. Some people say they'll leave the synagogue if there is no mechitza. Some people believe that if there is a mechitza. And he just wants someone to diffuse it. And he's read my stuff and he's heard me. He thought I could be a good mediator that can come in and just diffuse it and try to get some type of cordial agreement. Now he was preparing a mechitza, but he had to steward the situation because you're dealing here with a real war. He said that could end up not just become personal, break the shul apart, and a lot of all the collateral damage that comes with machlekes. So initially, my reaction was, I'm not interested in getting my head into this because I knew that this is emotionally charged issues and very difficult to resolve. But he kept on, he insisted, he said, listen, was there to lose, Finally, as I was thinking about it, I said, okay, listen, if I could be of help. I gave it some thought, and then we decided we'll plan the Shabbaton. It was a Shabbaton plan, come for Friday, and I'll leave Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, and I'll have the opportunity to meet the people, and we'll have talks about this. We titled it The Great Divide, the battle about the Mechitz, the Great Divide. And but I made one condition, that when I come into town from New York, I want to be able to sit down with the leaders that wanted no mechitza. I want to speak to them before Friday night comes, before the talks are delivered and so on. Okay, no problem. They were mostly women, I would say 95%, and they agreed to meet. We met, I landed in the morning and we met the early afternoon, and they were extremely belligerent and very hostile. They thought here they see a guy with a beard and a yarmulke, I'm probably coming to take the other side and fight with them and so on. But I was very pleasant, and I just simply started to talk to them. I want to hear your position. And they started telling to me they want to sit with their husbands and families. It's the only time they can do that in a religious setting. Then it'll just be separate. Some women felt second-class citizens. Some grew up in a very orthodox homes where they were treated always as like one of them put them said, we don't want to be sitting in a pig pen, an animal pen, etc. Anyway, and people had different things. So I said, do any of you know why anyone has instituted the mechitza in the first place in a shul? So most of them did not know. I think none of them knew, as most people did not. So I shared with them the following. I said, you have to remember, a shul is a migdash ma'at. It's a mini sanctuary that Yecheskel, when asking God what will happen once the temple is destroyed, the Jews where will they commune? He said, you'll have a Eilam migdash ma'at. They'll build small mini sanctuaries in each community that would be like a mini temple that would serve as a base medrash and a base hamikdash, like the base hamikdash, a base medrash, a place of study, place of prayer, base haknesses. And I said, now, since it's a mini sanctuary, it was created in the model of the original sanctuary. Do any of you have ever seen the model of the Holy Temple and how it was structured as is defined in the Bible and in Tanakh and so on? No. So I said, that not only were women not allowed in the main place where the Holy was, the Holy of Holies for sure, but men were not allowed. Only Kohanim and Levites. The Israelis, there was an Ezras Yisrael, there was an Ezras Anoshim, and there was an Ezras Noshim. And they would come 3 times a year to be Elul Regel, which was they made their pilgrimage, and they were not allowed into the place of service altogether. Some of them were surprised. I said, so it wasn't a matter of discrimination, it's because the temple, as many of the commentaries explained, the Shalah, the Rabbeinu Bachai, and I explained it to them somewhat relatively elaborately, explained that the temple is a microcosm of existence. So just like men and women, God created men and women, that's not up to us. And just like there's men's tennis and women's tennis that honors that, so basically what God created was just like there's a windpipe and there's a windpipe, an air pipe, and a food pipe, and the structure of existence has its boundaries. These are not about bad or good. It reflects the natural boundaries of what the temple was reflecting, the natural boundaries of existence. And we began talking about it. To make a long story short, we don't have the time to go through all the details because it was very fascinating. I will suffice it to say, by the end of Shabbos, that night already, the women in that meeting who were the most aggressive against the mechitza became the most aggressive supporting a mechitza, and so most importantly, to teach everyone what a mechitza is. What's my point? My point is that I didn't go there to make compromises and cut corners and say, okay, let's find a middle ground. Posha simply went and respected their intelligence and shared with them what the reasons are behind these things. When you know the reasons, especially when you know Chassidus, the neshama of the reasons. Just what we spoke about hair covering and other things. Firstly, become informed. Once you're informed, you look at it very differently. Secondly, it takes it away from the emotional arena and it gets diffused and becomes something you can have a conversation about. It doesn't mean everyone agreed, but the whole tone, the whole vibe was different. There was no longer the belligerence, there wasn't the hostility. And I wanted to do it before any talks. I didn't want it to become a debate when I'm getting up there Friday night or Shabbos morning or whatever it was. So we sometimes go back to the roots. The same thing here with the kotel. Yes, there's no question there's some women very aggressive, and maybe anything you say to them will not help. So there are guidelines, but I want to share the most important thing is the attitude, the approach. I would not do this idea the way you find people yelling at each other, throwing stones, or becoming tit for tat, as aggressive as the women of the wall are doing the same thing. Come on, that's embarrassing. Because that means you're in the same league. Come out, educate, speak to people, and so on. Will you diffuse everybody? Because some people see this as a political move, some see it as a statement. Obviously, there's plenty of hostilities. But you have to, as much as possible, try to eliminate and maybe just isolate the people that are just belligerent for whatever reason there is, isolate them. Instead, this has become a big rift in the same context. Now, there should be guidelines, just like there's guidelines in the shul, there's guidelines in other religious places. And I understand there's the denominations, and everyone says, well, there's a plurality. But all this can be addressed, just like Ben Gurion, for example, when he spoke about why he's giving the Orthodox rabbinate control over the Bezdin, over the Kedushin, the marriage, and so on. He said, it's the bar mitzvah example. If I make a bar mitzvah, and half my relatives or friends are kosher, and half are not kosher, I'm not getting two caterers. I'll get the kosher caterer, because everyone could eat kosher. So whether we like it or not, the people who have the highest standards are the ones that in a way will monopolize. Not because the word monopolize is a very threatening word, but because simply they have that standard. And I know that I can get a caterer that will satisfy everybody. Why would I get one that will alienate half? So this can all be addressed in a proper way, in a proper setting, if you have the right attitude. Now, I'm specifically not going into the halachic issue because that's not the forum here. What the halachas are, women putting on tefillin, not putting on tefillin. Yes, well, Shabbos we also don't put on tefillin, even though you could think Shabbos is the holiest day of the week. When better to put on tefillin? Because Shabbos itself is tefillin. Shabbos itself is an ois, is a sign. So in a sense, it's doing what tefillin would do the rest of the week. Now, what about the fact that all women are Shabbos? They're all week they're Shabbos, Shabbos Malka. Not Shabbos in the technical sense of it, but just like you say, Talmud Chochem Ikra Shabbos. Same thing with a woman. Someone once came to the Frierdiker Rebbe, and it was the middle of the week, and he asked the Frierdiker Rebbe to say, "Am I Chassidus?" The Frierdiker Rebbe said, "It's not Shabbos." I say, "For my Morim Shabbos." He says, "When I come to the Rebbe, Talmud Chochem Ikra Shabbos, I come to the Rebbe, me it's Shabbos." And the Frierdiker Rebbe went and said, "Amayim." The point is, there's a level called Shabbos, and it's not necessarily a deprivation. Now you have people just like Rosh Hashanah, Cholias b'Shabbos. You don't blow shofar because Rosh Hashanah, Chassidus explains, Shabbos does what shofar would do. In the Beis HaMikdash did blow shofar because it's a higher level. So the fact that the Rashi's daughter, we have other stories of people who put on tefillin, the few instances that Michal Bashal and so on, is perhaps like that. You could explain it that way. But the point of all of this is really another discussion, which is not for now, is to understand that everyone is equal in the eyes of God and we all have our mission. And healthy couples understand that. The man does his thing, the woman does his thing, and there's no such thing as discrimination, there's no such thing as second-class citizens. The fact that many people have abused their power, especially male hierarchies, doesn't make the Torah an abuser. It means people have abused it. Now this deserves its own discussion. I just wanted to address it from the women of the wall, but I will talk about this, the whole issue of feminism and the issue of women's role in Judaism and so on, but not at another time. Okay. Next question. Finding purpose in life. Let me just get my order here. I am the type of person who needs step-by-step instructions on how to get things done. I've read many of your articles about purpose in life, but for me, they seem abstract. As I need specific outline, do step 1, 2, 3. Can you help? Thank you so very much. I'll try my best. Obviously, when you're talking about big questions, even lahavdil, when you're looking for a purpose in a mission statement in a business, it doesn't come overnight. But there are practical steps, yes. The first and most important thing is to recognize that why is there purpose in life? Because there's a grand designer, a cosmic designer, an architect that placed us in this world. And like any architect, like anyone with a plan, means that you're here for a reason. You didn't come here by accident. You didn't fall into this earth by accident. So the given is, the first assumption, axiom, musculation, everybody has a unique mission. And your mission is different than everybody else's. That's a critical component, because if without that, you can't go further. How do you discover your mission? It would have been nice if we came out of our mother's wombs with a little journal or a booklet saying, here's your mission and here's what you need to do to fulfill it. But that's not the way it is. And God wanted us to find our missions. So talking practical, let's cut straight to the practical chase. I have online some articles I've written about this. If you send us your email at meaningfullife.com/mylife, we will be happy to send these articles. But I called it, maybe a cute way to put it, a POP exercise, P-O-P-P. POP is an acronym for personality, opportunities, people, and places. What does that mean? If you want to find out your mission, the first thing to do is find out who you are. God would not send somebody, let's say, with a musical soul, with talents to do something that they can't exercise and express their musical side. So if you have a musical part to you, clearly that's part of your mission. So the first thing is identifying your personality. Some people are cerebral, some people are emotional, some people are very good with data, some people are very good at analytics, others are very creative. I mean, the list goes on. Identify your personality. Your personality, your natural personality. Some people are excellent with people, some people are good with books. And that tells you, why did God give you this type of personality? Because that personality fits the mission that you need to find. Number two is opportunities. Everybody has unique opportunities. My opportunities are different than yours, based on life circumstances. So that's the second thing to list on a paper. Step three is look at the people you know. The people. Who do you know? You know certain connections that you have. And finally, the third is the places that you've been to, where you're born, what country, the places you've traveled to, the places you've lived, the places you've studied. These are all part of what we'll call the divine choreography that defines your hashgacha pratis, the trajectory of the divine providence of your life. And since nothing's an accident, all those four things can map out the coordinates that will help you navigate and figure out what is your calling. That's the most practical way that I could define it. But you have to be ready to do it and not allow you being trapped by the material concerns and all the habits and routines that we're stuck in to get in the way. Because that's going to be the biggest challenge. You already have your habits. You're doing things. So who has time to now review my whole life in that sense? But if you really want to find your purpose, these are the requirements. Okay. Regarding there was many questions about Tznius and hair covering and so on. As I said, I'm going to cover only the element of the Mashpia aspect, which I think I addressed. And I do want to say something in that context, that you do have different types of teachers and different types of mentors who teach in different ways. Some, for example, are more stringent, some are more lenient, some give more sources, others less. Some feel not to confuse a young couple, just give them a simple approach. Others feel more hands-off. I'm not going to say that one way is the best way and the other ways, all the other ways are no good. I think this is very nuanced in the sense where some people need more of one than the other. But I will say, as I'm referring back to the Rebbe's note, it's critical that whoever you speak to, both the Mashpia and the Mushpa, should have that type of sense of who you're speaking to. Giving sources, giving an understanding is always helpful. At the same time, people just sometimes really need to hear what's right, what's wrong. So I can't answer that. I just wanted to add that into the equation of this context. Okay. Now, next, let's go to the next question, which is some follow-up on the dating issue. A sad chapter, but we need to address it. Dating non-Jew follow-up. So 2 weeks ago, I believe I spoke about this. So here we have, Dear Rabbi Jacobson, I look forward to your video every Sunday. Even though I became a Baalas Tshuva over 40 years ago, you have given me a new insight and understanding on a number of issues for which I am very grateful. Last week, you read a letter from a girl whose friend was going out with a non-Jewish boy, and she asked for your guidance on how to deal with her friend. You gave her excellent advice. I also have a question regarding a similar situation in our family. My brother's daughter has been going out with a non-Jewish boy for some time. My brother, who is not frum, has told me lately that it appears to be serious. While he does not like the idea of his daughter marrying a non-Jew, he justifies his acceptance of the situation to the fact that the young man is a very nice person. And being that my niece is already in her 30s, he, my brother, will be grateful for just that. My brother and I are not very close, but we get along very well. And I have little to do with my niece, except for when we meet at family events. On this matter, I don't feel I could have any influence on either one of them, or my sister-in-law. I expect that it will not be long before their engagement is announced. My question at this point is, how should I respond to the anticipated engagement announcement? I, of course, will not compromise on our view on this matter, but I still want to maintain a good relationship with my brother and his family. Thank you in advance for your guidance. Another question, which came from the person who wrote the original question. Dear Rabbi Jacobson, this goes back again, episode 97 or 96, I think. One of the two. Dear Rabbi Jacobson, thank you for addressing my question regarding a friend dating a non-Jew. Obviously, it is a complicated and complex issue which involves many details that are beyond the scope of this email. You mentioned that marrying a non-Jew would not only be no good for her, but also for him. Would you please elaborate on both these details? As more than anything, I really need to know how to explain to her the importance and gravity of this matter. Regarding your question of whether they plan on eventually marrying, originally she told me she would not marry him. However, as time has passed, and they are speaking multiple times a day and have gotten closer, she says she will take this slowly and perhaps eventually consider marriage. If not marriage, she would be happy to live with him and have children. I should mention that she has a sibling who lives and has children with a non-Jew and is very happy. Of course, I'm not judging her, yet it pains me to see her going down this road. I never imagined I would be in a situation like this. However, being that I am, I want to make sure I have the right answers. I would really appreciate any guidance you can give me on this situation. Thank you again. Of all subjects, this again is very limited what one can say without knowing the parties involved, because everyone is different, but I will say a few general principles. The key challenge here is balancing two elements here, similar to what I said before about the women of the wall. There's the actual facts and what should be our attitude, and there's the approach, how to, the what and the how. What should be our attitude to it, and how should we approach it? The how is frankly far more vital than the what. The what is pretty black and white. And let me explain, and we should know for ourselves, whether this should be said to the parties. This needs to be determined case by case. God is the one that created the human being. God is the one that created Jews and non-Jews. And each has their role to play. Marriage is not just a business contract where two people who like each other work together with each other. It has a spiritual dimension to it. And there are people who a marriage, and if you understand the significance, the spiritual significance of marriage, you understand it's not good, not for the man, not for the woman, in this case, to marry, because you need spiritual compatibility. This doesn't mean that one is better than the other. That's why I said for the man, even for the non-Jewish man, it's also not for him. Besides the fact, as the Rebbe points out often, that because marriages in general are so difficult to sustain, especially when you add this into the equation and you bring children in, and then it becomes all kinds of issues of where you're going to send them the kids to school, and religious issues will crop up, even if both were not that religious at the time, and people hide how many kind of friction and tension. But then there's the deeper spiritual thing. Who's fitting to whom? And this does not take away from people's value and beauty. They're beautiful non-Jews, they're beautiful Jews. So understanding that spiritual compatibility is a critical component, that is vital to know when entering this. Now the problem is most people have no clue. They think it's a cultural thing, they think it's to have Jewish children. That's a small part of it. But ultimately it's souls meshing, soulmates. And soulmates require certain compatibilities. And when you know what those compatibilities are, that's when you understand these boundaries and why they're so important. Now, with that said, the question is now how to approach it. That's the what. The how is case by case. Obviously, you can't do anything that breaks halacha or Torah. On the other hand, you do not want to alienate, especially people who don't know better. Because if you're a family member, you want to make sure that you stay close to them. If you're a friend, you have to stay close. Now, this will take a lot of finesse of knowing how to communicate to someone that I can't come to your wedding because of this. At the same time, I really care for you and I love you. Now, I wouldn't just start with the wedding. It would be also, can I influence them in the right way? That's why I limit my words, because each case, you need to have someone that can guide you, if you can't do it yourself, how to communicate and what to say, what can be perhaps said to help people. Remember, once people are in the emotional throes of a relationship, they love each other, so to speak. What are you going to say? They say love conquers all. Very hard to talk to people in that type of circumstance. What I often do when I deal with the situation is say, listen, it's a very serious decision, marriage, soulmates and all of that, and it's God's bigger cosmic plan. Every soul has its soulmate before they were born. So before you enter into that, and really like lift it up in a very romantic way even, to a very high level of marriage, a high level of high standards, so maybe it's best to learn more about what marriage is. And the hope, of course, is by learning more, they'll be more informed, and this issue will come up. That's what I would add to the discussion. And again, if you want to follow up more specifically, personally, I'm happy to talk to you about it and give you my input as best as I can. Okay. Let me just say a few more comments about some follow-up. I spoke about the Tzimtzum a few weeks ago, and I just wanted to tie up a few points that I just wanted to mention that I never ended up speaking about. And that is, there's an interesting letter from the Rebbe in volume, Nigros Kodesh, volume 3, page Reish Chaf Hey. Someone asked the Rebbe that, about Tzimtzum, not kipshute, that, let me just find the right page. I think I'm not looking at the right page. The Rebbe says there, actually, no, let me correct myself. In volume 19, page 81, it also talks about it on that other page that I just mentioned. But in volume 19, page 81, the Rebbe says that someone asked the Rebbe, what does it mean that it says elsewhere that the Shitta of the Ramak, Ramosha Koraviro, is that there's no space that God is not there, including even the lowly creatures. That is Shitta Ramak. Isn't that the Shitta of the Tzimtzum Not Kipshute, which is the Arizal? Like he explains in the Geras HaKodesh 25. So the Rebbe says that we know that Tzimtzum didn't exist in the Kabbalah of the Arizal, in the Kabbalah of the Ramak, only in the Kabbalah of the Arizal. And nevertheless, the reason he chooses that, because by the Ramak, initially there's no question of Tzimtzum Kipshute or not Kipshute, literally or not literally. The reason I point it out is because it's interesting that the Rebbe would bring that and state that and needs a lot more explanation. But since I was talking about the topic, it's one thing I wanted to touch upon. Another thing that was left untouched, last week I spoke about time and space, and the question of the Chassidus question of the week was, is there time and space in the higher worlds? And the answer is absolutely yes. So someone asked the question, I use the word that Vayichulu in Samach Vav and Ayin Beis in some places talks about time and space, that in the spiritual sense of it, obviously it's not past, present, and future as we know it. It's far more there, what's called K'dima V'ichur, which means conceptual hierarchy and conceptual space. And I use the expression from the Maimorim, Rotzi V'shuv, that it all begins with a dual movement and pulsating movement of Rotze and Shuv, which is like yearning and returning, a dual force. And higher than that was Moti V'lei Moti, which is an expression from Zoyar, from Eitz Chaim, Moti V'lei Moti. Now I use the word desire and not desire. And now the truth is the actual translation of the word, much more fitting, is there's different places that people translate. Moti and Loi Moti is, let me just find, it means sometimes touching and not touching. Moti from the word touch and not touch. So it's a place where it's touching slightly and not touching, referring to the higher levels of the divine. Are they touching or they're not touching? Sometimes the words are reaching, not reaching, or retreating, pulsating forth or reabsorbed. Just to be thorough about the translation. I use the word desire, not because moti means desire, but essentially it's referring to does God desire or does not desire, and that dual dance, so to speak, is what creates the pulsating energy that creates the difference between past, present, and future in the spiritual realm. So I just wanted to add that into the whole pot. Now let's go over to the Chassidus question of this week. and to the essays. And we will begin the Chassidus question is as follows. While learning Shar Yichud V'Amunah, chapter 1, that's of course the second section of Tanya, I was doubtful about what the Alter Rebbe means when saying that the Hebrew name of every existing entity is the life force that perpetually sustains and energizes that entity. Does that apply only to the raw material as first created by God, or even to the actual form it takes on at any given point? For example, if a piece of wood is turned into a chair, is the makeup of the chair no longer through the letters of the word eitz, wood, but rather it's now through the letters kisei, chair? Or is the form of the object, the chair, only what the Alter Rebbe calls in the second chapter in Shar Yichud V'Amunah, Maisa Enosh, a man's handiwork of reshaping an object from one form into another, yesh miyesh. And it doesn't actually affect the essence of the wood. In other words, is every word in Lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew a sheresh, a root of the thing it represents and is referring to, meaning that's basically what the Hebrew tongue, Lashon HaKodesh, really is, a vocabulary of components of the divine? Or is it only in regard to certain words, Hebrew words, and the rest of the language being just that, a language like all others? On the same note, how will that refer to verbs such as yeshiva or halicha, to sit or to walk? Also the source of those acts, or is this only said in regard to things that have a makeup of Dvar Hashem Shebasar Mamoris? In other words, only to objects or also to movement and so on, or only to things that have a makeup from the 10 utterances that God uttered when he created the world. Okay, very good set of questions. And briefly, let's take it step by step here. Firstly, there's two elements here. Shar Yichud V'Amunah, his main point there is that what energizes, what sustains any given object is Shmoyeh Sharikale B'Lashon HaKodesh. Yes, the holy tongue, the name that it has. Now, we know there's the 10 utterances, Asara Mamoris Nivra Elam, and 10 includes Bereshis, of course, includes Yehi light, Rakia, Tache, Yodas Desha, vegetation, Rakia, the heavens, and so on. So the Alter Rebbe explained, it doesn't include every object in existence. For example, a stone. It doesn't say Yehi Evan. Yet, because the 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet have all different configurations, those 10 Maimaris are the main categories, and that breaks down. So every object in existence has a name, and that name is what gives it its power. And that's why Adam HaRishon, when he was called to give names, it wasn't just random. It wasn't arbitrary. He knew the sheirish, he knew the root to give a sheir, the name sheir, and so on. Adam, and so when you study the Hebrew letters and the name, and all the aspects of the name, not just the meaning of the name, but also the gematria, as I mentioned, the tpuris and chilufim, the different permutations, and so on, teach you about the energy that is the soul of this object. So the name actually reveals to you what this thing is about. Now, you can apply that across the board to everything. The Rebbe uses it for the names of people, the names, of course, of the parshas, the names of everything. That includes halicha, and because that name is not just a random name. Like in English, we use the word walk, or we use the word sit. They may have some Latin root, but at the end of the day, it's just a word. It could have been a different word. It's an arbitrary thing. It's shemus heskomim, it says. Names that were agreed upon. A mutual agreement, let's call this and this name. Just like we would call a country by the name France or Israel or whatever it is. Israel is not a good example, actually. But it's a name that people agreed upon. Then there's shemus atzmim, a shame that is not heskomi. Not just people agreed upon. The name itself gives energy, gives life to that object. Similar to what you say about Eidim, there's Eidei Kiyum and there's Eidei Riyah. There's Eidei Kiyum, that the Eidim themselves are what sustain and create that particular thing, let's say Eidei Kedushin, by marriage. And then there's Eidei Riyah, basically their job is to confirm, they tell you what happened. So now, with that said, then every Hebrew name has that type of power. Now, then you take a piece of wood now, and you turn it into a chair, nothing changed, it's still wood. So what gives life to this thing now is eitz. It's still eitz. Just because the eitz has been shaped doesn't change its life force. Human beings, exactly as you pointed out, yesh mi yesh, shaped it into something else. It's still what's sustaining it is wood. If you mix the wood with other aluminum or with other objects, or man-made or divine, then obviously So there's different things that are sustaining this object because now you've made a hybrid, you've made a type of alloy. You've made a combination of different things, a composite. But the life force comes from that thing called eitz. Same thing if you make something out of stone. Now there's a mimer from some place in Chassidus, in Tere'er Mekates, in the beginning of the Ner Chanukah mimer, and Kuntus Etzachaim in the beginning, and the Hemshech Rosh Hashanah Tavshin Ches, chapter 32 and chapter 39. Same thing, Hemshech Tavshin Yud, Hemshech Rosh Hashanah Tavshin Yud, chapter 8, talk about that there's the creation of the Chaymer, which is, yes, it says there, it talks about two different verses. Some places it says that Kol Asher Chofetz Hashem Asa, everything God desires He creates. And then it says, Dvar Hashem Shemayim Nasu, sometimes with God's words, B'ruach Piv, with His words He spoke. So it says, so the Alter Rebbe explains, other places explains it differently, but there he explains, and the different sources I just cited, is that the Chaymer, the actual raw material, that's created by Dvar Hashem. Because the words define what the exact raw material is. But the tzura, the shape and form, that's created by Chofetz Hashem, by God's desire. So whether, for example, something will be round, something will be triangle, something will be circular, well I said round, and so on, that is defined by God's desire. But the actual letters that vivify existence, that is connected to the dibur, and that's only the raw material. So based on that, it seems from there, I can't say it's definitive, but most seems from that the matter of tzura, shaping something, does not change the Dvar Hashem that's in that object. And yes, kisei will still be the Hebrew word that tells you what this chair, but the chair was not created by God. It's a ma'aseh de Adam taking other objects. So you have elements, if someone says, what is this chair made of? You'll say it's made of eitz and other elements, and that tells you the life force within that. The chair, the name kisei, will tell you what the function is. We also know Chassidus talks about a Shem HaEtzem, a Shem HaToyar, Shem HaPu'ula, and Shem HaMushal. Shem HaEtzem is the core name of something. Shem HaToyar is a description of it. Shem HaPu'ula is its function. And Shem HaMushal is like a nickname. So you see there too, names have different elements, and Chassidus talks about that at length. Okay, I hope that suffices. Let's go over to the essays, 3 essays as we've been doing. Essay number 1. Educating Through Love or Fear by David Ginsburg, age 21, Yeshiva Schools of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The following essay compares the relationship of love and fear of God, as explained in a Chassidic discourse, to the role love and fear play in education. We then glean a practical application in the choice between discipline with fear or love. Basically, goes into education. With regard to education, the question is well known. What is the most effective way to educate a child? Is it with firm discipline by instilling fear in a child, or to embrace the child with love and warmth so that the child will be motivated to do the right thing on his own? Modern thought that most schooling systems adopt and enforce a very gentle and non-demanding attitude in education. They claim that being too demanding and controlling can have detrimental effects. However, their approach can lead to a negligence in proper behavior, lack of reverence, and so on. Then he goes on to say the relationship between parent and child, between student and teacher, reflects the relationship of the Jewish people with God, and goes to explain the parallels and the things we can learn of how to combine both these elements. And uses a mimer from Mashpatim Tavshin Yud Beis from the Rebbe to do exactly that. The benefits of serving in love, the benefits of serving through yira, which can be defined as awe, and how you have to combine the two. And he develops few educational strategies based on the balance of the two. How to reprimand, how to think about the children, and how to be patient. So, a very interesting essay that touches, of course, a very fundamental thing, and ultimately teaching us that we need a very serious combination of both, and one without the other will not work. Okay, essay number 1. Number 2 is essay, Do You Live Life or Does Life Live You? By Yochanan Ress, age 37, clinical psychologist. You could either live by design or live by default. And goes into the psychological terminology sometimes called personal mastery, internal focus, internal locus of control versus external locus of control. And how this is now supported by quantum physics, quantum mechanics, that the observer affects what they observe. Anyway, then he goes into basically having a case showing Chassidus is based on this principle that the place where a person's mind is set, that's where they are. He gives a whole bunch of examples from the Baal Shem Tov, from Nigla, from Chassidus, and does interesting comparisons between the Rebbe's Maimer. He says, Purim Tafshin Mem Ches, I guess he means Maimer, with the scientific phenomenon known as lucid dreaming. Anyway, it's very interesting, quoting as well the Zohar that talks about Kagavne, the Inun the Yachdin Lamaila, the Lamata, how essentially how our actions and our behavior and our attitudes, Dama Lamaila, what is above is Mimcha, is from you. And how our personal behavior, mindfulness, affects the larger worlds, and develops through that a whole approach to an internal locus of control as opposed to an external one, meaning that you can fundamentally change things through this attitude. And finally, essay number 3 is Tapping into the Infinite by Sophia Katz, age 19, Mayonat Women's Program in Yerushalayim. So she writes about tapping into the infinite. What is your drive that gets you out of bed to the cup of coffee and out the door into a day of unending possibilities? What gives you the strength? And she talks about different motivations, self-fulfillment, and so on. And brings from Matan Torah, using Matan Torah as an example, that Har Sinai was dafka a mountain, not a valley, to show you that you need to have both element of pride, an element of self-respect, using her words. You have to be someone to receive something which is given before you have bittul and humility, a sense of self, and balancing that with a sense of humility. When you go beyond the you, she writes, a Torah mountain, a true mountain emerges made up of everything, of everyone and everything. Anyway, it's an interesting essay in balancing these two forces, and worthwhile reading as the other two as well. This is all on meaningfullife.com/mylife, or you could even go meaningfullife.com/essays and find these essays as well. If you subscribe to our weekly newsletter, we post a new essay every week. So this has been MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 98. Again, everyone should have a very freilich and chedesh of spreading bayit hativ Chassidus in every possible language, every possible forum, every possible paradigm, and a way of chutzah. And when Mashiach promised the Baal Shem Tov that kishifutza manasach chutzah, that's when osimar da malka Mashiach.